the other thing that, has always been true for me about being involved with ONS. It's not just about the work that we were able to do and the pride that I took in that work, but also in the relationships that I've built along the way that are so meaningful and become lifelong.
I would encourage if you are an advocate, if you want to move the profession forward, if you have been progressively involved in ONS and other oncology nursing leadership opportunities, that you would consider using ONS to further your professional development.
It helps to have people who have different backgrounds, people who have different roles in oncology nursing. They understand what the organization needs and what the members need. And so I think that our recent focus on diversity is really important. And we need that diversity on the board and in the leadership of the organization.
You're listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast, where ONS Voices Talk Cancer, a resource from the Oncology Nursing Society. Through conversations with subject matter experts, we examine the important issues in oncology nursing, from new treatments to patient-centered research to advancements in clinical practice. Join us as we hear from nurses in all facets of oncology care, from bench to bedside and everywhere in between. Welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Hello, and welcome to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Jardine, Oncology Clinical Specialist at ONS. And today we are joined by ONS Board of Director members Nancy Houlihan, Kristen Ferguson, and Marty Polovich. They will be having a conversation reflecting on experiences and what the work of the ONS board entails, among other things. You can also earn free NCPD contact hours by completing the evaluation we've linked in the episode notes. Nancy, you have been president for 2 of the 3 years you have been on the board, and will end your term on the board at Congress this year. Why don't you begin the conversation by telling us a bit about your background in oncology nursing, and then Kristen and Marty can follow.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction and for inviting us to talk about what it means to serve in the leadership of ONS. The aim of this podcast is to inform our listeners about the work of ONS leaders and how they might consider following us in this important work. So to answer your question, I've been an oncology nurse for my whole career, primarily at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York. I had many clinical roles and as a clinical nurse specialist in both acute and ambulatory care. In more recent years, I've had progressive leadership roles, to my most recent role as a director of nursing practice. I'm a longtime member of ONS, which I consider my professional home. What helped in my career development has always been having mentors, and that includes mentors in my workplace, in my academic affiliations, and most importantly, in ONS. It certainly helped to steer me into leadership roles. Kristen, do you want to share your oncology experience?
Yeah, thank you, Nancy, and thank you for being a part of this podcast today. I've been an oncology nurse for almost 13 years, my whole career as well as a nurse. I started off working as a new graduate nurse on a surgical oncology floor. This was a floor where we mainly took care of people after surgeries for major cancers such as pancreatic cancer, colon cancer, GYN cancers, etc. And I worked there for several years, eventually being promoted as the assistant nursing director for the floor. Meanwhile, I had also been going to school part-time and getting my master's in nursing. And after a number of years in that leadership role, I decided, I wanted to see a more broad picture of oncology. I liked working with patients one-on-one at a really critical point in their treatment after major surgeries. But I wanted to see, more of the broad scope of what patients went throughout their cancer journey. And so I transitioned roles and I became a nurse navigator for breast cancer patients. And that was a great role because I was able to see from diagnosis through treatment everything that a patient goes through and really be their point of contact between their physicians and their different treatments. Meanwhile, I went back to school. I clearly have a pattern, and I obtained my doctorate in nursing practice from Duke University. And I have to mention, like you said, Nancy, throughout all of these roles and journeys in school, I had mentors as well that encouraged me to take progressive leadership positions. It was originally a mentor at my first job who introduced me to ONS. And, when I had started as a new grad nurse, I had known ONS to be the organization that puts on the chemotherapy course. I think that that's probably what people, very new grads think of when they think of ONS. But I went to my first ONS meeting in Washington, D.C., which is where I've lived my whole career, and met nurses from all around the region, and the region being DC, so it's quite small, but different places working in different oncology roles, and I became very excited. And I started attending conferences, and I just loved it. I loved hearing about what other nurses were doing in oncology, the latest knowledge, and that's really what brought me into ONS. Marty, how did you start getting involved, and how did your career begin in oncology?
Well, Kristen, it took me about 7 years working as a nurse before I found my way to oncology. But when I did, and since then, I can't imagine doing any other kind of nursing. I had an excellent nurse manager who helped lead me to the education that I needed in order to practice in oncology. I gave lots of chemotherapy. I took care of surgical patients, patients with solid tumors and heme malignancies, and that's what you get in a community hospital setting. The only academic setting I've ever worked at was at Duke, and even that was the outreach, taking care of patients in community settings throughout North Carolina. I worked with GYN and surgery patients, and I met some CNSs along the way who also taught me a lot about how to be a good oncology nurse. And they knew so much, and I was just in awe of the kind of care that they provided. And so I wanted to practice at the level they did. So I went back to school to earn my master's degree. And I wanted to be a clinical leader in nursing. I never felt called to management in any way, but clinical leadership was what I wanted. And so, going back to school, I also met some people who mentored me on how to do that. So, really, going back to school opened a lot of doors for me, even though that might not be what everybody wants to do. It was what I needed to do at that time.
So one of the things that I think is a misconception about ONS leadership is that you have to have advanced degrees and you have to have, 20 plus years of experience and membership in ONS. And I think that, the three of us kind of represent a span of different experiences and different kind of generations. Would you agree with me, Kristen?
I would agree. I think it's a common misconception that you have to have been a leader in ONS for 20 plus years to even think about putting your name in the hat to be a member of the national board. But I had only been a member for, I want to say, 7 years before I decided to, apply for board leadership. And this was due in part to, different mentors who I had met who had said to me when I was studying for my DNP, in a couple years, you might want to consider board leadership. Or, well, they had said in the future, if you want to, you should think about board leadership. And I said, oh, yeah, that sounds great. I'll think about it in another 10 years. And they said, no, you don't need to wait 10 years. You can probably do it in like 2 or 3 years if you were interested after you get your DNP, not to be overwhelmed. And that really kind of helped turn me into thinking, well, I do know that there need to be leaders of all generations in any type of leadership role, especially boards that really require diversity of thought. And you want people from different backgrounds coming together to strengthen the strategic plan and initiatives like that boards work on.
Also, it helps to have people who have different backgrounds, who come from different parts of the country. Even though we're all on the east of the Mississippi, we do have board members from the other side of the country as well. And that brings a lot of different perspective that we need, people who have different roles in oncology nursing. They understand what the organization needs and what the members need. And so I think that our recent focus on diversity is really important. And we need that diversity on the board and in the leadership of the organization.
Yeah, Marty, I'm glad you mentioned that because we have spent a lot of time in this board the last couple of years really expanding kind of our thinking about diversity. So diversity of generations is really important. I think that's what we've just addressed. But I think, we think certainly about our commitment to anti-racism and also to be gender inclusive. So when we think about recruiting to the board, we're really considering all of those factors to make up a board that brings that diversity of thought, as Kristen just said, and experience and background. And so, as you think about yourself, our listeners, and how you may aspire to participating in ONS at a different level, think about what you bring and could offer to a board to make that composition as diverse as possible, because that is really what's important. It really is also what's behind the change we made to our bylaws in this last year, which you may or may not be aware of, but was a really important step for us to be able to make sure that we identify candidates that kind of fit the needs of the board in terms of diversity, and that we can ensure a process so that we end up with the best candidates and the best slate of candidates that we possibly can. So while we strive for diversity in board membership, there are definitely common factors that, we all kind of bring to our preparation and serving. One of them definitely is our experience in chapters. Kristen, you want to talk about your experience?
Absolutely. My local chapter is the National Capital Chapter, which is the DC Lower Maryland region, if you will. And it has different hospitals and oncology programs from nurses from all types of roles participate, including NIH, so nurses involved in nursing research. And one thing that I would say is pretty unique to my chapter is that we are in the capital of the country, Washington, D.C. And so there's a lot of advocacy opportunities locally available to us that Alex Stone will sometimes present to us, who is our ONS Director of Public Affairs. There's something called the Capitol Hill Gang that I became involved in, and it's an informal ONS group. You can sign up, just on on the listserv, and you'll get emails from Alec about opportunities to attend different events in DC related to healthcare legislation, public meetings, and give your input as an oncology nurse. And so I've been able to attend several of these over the years, as able to, with my regular jobs. And I believe this involvement led me to being one of 8 oncology nurses from ONS selected to attend the Biden Cancer Moonshot Summit in the summer of 2016, which was held at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Now, this was when then Vice President Biden was appointed by then President Obama to lead an initiative on cancer and moving the needle. And it was so exciting to participate along with many people from other industries, healthcare, but also tech, science, policy, media, and a lot of others invested on improving cancer care outcomes. And so during that time, I became progressively more involved in my local chapter, eventually taking on leadership roles, first as the secretary, then as the president elect and the president. We hosted Congress when I was past president here. I believe it was in 2018. And, it just kind of went from there. I just kept becoming more and more involved in ONS at the local level, eventually being involved in some national initiatives, not only the Moonshot, but the Millennial Advisory Panel, which was an initiative by ONS to hear from millennials and what they needed out of professional organizations and how ONS could meet their needs in growing as an oncology nurse. And so all of that progressive involvement in ONS led me to want to eventually apply for board leadership.
That's a great track record for you in terms of describing how to prepare. And the chapters do that for us, right? We learn all about governance at that local level. And, there are opportunities there, as you've, described, that make it possible for us then to move into opportunities at the national level. For myself, I was a member of the New York City chapter, which is a large chapter. And again, oftentimes because of the location that we work, and the chapter that we belong to, there are opportunities that arise for us to become more involved. But I also served on my chapter board as director at large for quite a number of years, and really had the opportunity to mentor a lot of other nurses that rose through those leadership roles in the chapter as well. But Marty, you had a really different experience in chapters. Why don't you tell us about that?
My experience is different because I've been a member of many chapters. My husband worked for a railroad and we moved around quite a bit. My first intro to ONS was when I lived in New Orleans, and the New Orleans Oncology Nurses, or NOON chapter, had just been chartered by ONS, and it was a really exciting time to be there. And then my husband was transferred to Buffalo, New York, and so my family moved there. And one of the first things I did because of my experience with an ONS chapter in New Orleans was to contact the Western New York chapter president, who was Mary Garlick Roll, who later was elected as ONS president. So what an experience that was. She invited me to the next chapter meeting so I could get connected with the local oncology nurses. And then those connections helped me find my first CNS position. Of course, there were other mentors from that chapter and several other chapters. I served as newsletter editor. Remember when there were newsletters from the chapters? Membership chairperson and vice president. These are all volunteer opportunities. And I think that's one of the things about leaderships where leaders are willing to volunteer to work for something that's important to them. And certainly the chapters were important to me. Another move brought me to Atlanta and the MAONS chapter. And there, once again, that chapter connection helped me find my position in that area. I served as newsletter editor and was elected chapter president in that chapter. So I helped to form a new chapter as well, the Southern Crescent South Suburban Atlanta chapter, and I was its first president. I've also been a member of TONS, which is Triangle Oncology Nursing Society in Durham, North Carolina. And then I moved back to Atlanta, where I found my home again with the 2 chapters there. So each chapter provides an opportunity to learn some leadership skills in a different way and help prepare me for the board at the national level. And again, it's volunteer work.
So Marty, you must get the prize of the the number of chapters you joined and belong to. So in addition to our chapter leadership, though, I think there were other kind of opportunities or experiences that brought us to national leadership. For me, I actually was involved in ONS in various ways, but mostly as an educator and as a writer. Those were really my participation experiences. But then I did, through mentoring, run for the old nominating committee. There was a time when, for many years, we had a nominating committee whose job it was to really put forward a slate of candidates for the election. And so that was my first experience at a national level. And working in the nominating committee, just helped to inform me and the rest of us on the committee about the serious leadership responsibilities of ONS leaders. That just then really led me to throw my name in the hat for a board position. The nominating committee, as you probably know, went on to become the Leadership Development Committee. And by making that transition, actually, we grew the whole process for identifying, mentoring nurses, and then to really begin to think about kind of the expanded concepts around board composition and diversity. So that was really like a whole growth from the nominating committee. But it was that experience that really kind of led me then to run for the board. So Kristen, you want to talk about your experiences?
Yeah. I mean, in addition to what I mentioned, I also became involved in speaking at a few international conferences through ONS. And that was, a big deal for me because I'm not a natural public speaker. I have to work at it. But I know it's so important as an advocate to be feeling comfortable in sharing your voice and sharing your experience, especially in forums where you might be the only nurse or the only type of oncology nurse from a particular background. And so I would say that type of advocacy and working on feeling comfortable and speaking up are really important in leadership roles, but especially in serving on a board. I would say that advocacy is probably one of my favorite leadership qualities to work on. Maybe it's my background in living in DC, but I think it's just important to be able to express when you might have a different viewpoint than one of your colleagues, or you want to add to the conversation by sharing a story about a patient that you worked with. And so, wanting to be an advocate and wanting to move the profession forward and encourage growth in oncology nursing motivated me to want to pursue board leadership.
Well, my interest in hazardous drug safety sort of led me to board leadership, or at least leadership in ONS earlier. I was very interested in hazardous drug exposure for healthcare workers, of course, oncology nurses, but also pharmacists and pharmacy techs and people who work in other areas like arthritis care where hazardous drugs are used. And I was very interested in spreading the word about how healthcare workers could protect themselves. And so I became interested in speaking on this. And so I had the name leadership, and I helped to write those sections in the ONS chemotherapy guidelines and teach them in the ONS chemotherapy course that you mentioned, Kristen. And so I think that clinical interest and being a clinical leader for the safety of our members helped give me the name recognition that helped me get elected to the ONS board.
Thanks, Marty. Certainly, that is something that you are well known for and has been a great contribution to oncology nursing. The fact that that led you to a leadership position in ONS is just, really speaks to your abilities to make that transition from such a clinical focus and then into the governance role. So we were elected 3 years ago. I think, if we three of us think back about what we thought we would be doing over those next 3 years, it certainly did not include dealing with leadership during a pandemic. That certainly led us to kind of make a very quick transition and created unprecedented needs for our association in terms of decision making. Serious decisions we had to make without a lot of information, canceling Congress and what that would mean for us as an organization. The changes that we had to make in terms of very quickly providing resources for our members who were delivering chemotherapy, dealing with PPE shortages, dealing with all of the infection control issues in their workplace and the stress that that produced. And ONS was very committed to try to provide the level of support that was needed for nurses to practice during that time. So Marty or Kristen, do you want to just comment, or just reflect on your feelings about leading during this time?
Sure. Yeah. I would say, it's been a whirlwind. That's all I can say. Really unpredictable. Like I'm sure everyone, in any situation has felt, 2020, now it seems like so long ago, but I think we can all remember it like it was just yesterday. The three of us joined the board at the same time. So Congress of 2019, and we had, almost a year of regular board work where, some of it's in person, some of it's remote. But in March of 2020, like everybody else, our board work went fully remote for the next year and a half, I would say. And so members joining the board in 2020, we worked a lot to get to know them virtually in having different forums, not just our board meetings, but trying to have virtual happy hours or our one-on-ones in order to help promote the board work and getting to know them so we could work well together. And so it was great to meet everyone in person in fall of 2021. When we did meet in person, it was like we had already known each other for a long time. And it was strange to think, oh, this is the first time some of us are meeting each other in person. But we had done all of that work. And I think everyone would agree that, in-person communication and meetings definitely is the gold standard when it comes to group work. But if you have a group that's very committed, such as we were, can still really get to know each other quite well over Zoom and or whatever remote platform you choose in order to have a good working relationship.
I was certainly unhappy about having to cancel Congress, which we had a series of meetings to discuss the pros and cons of it. And we really wanted our members to be safe. And we, even though it was a very difficult decision, we knew that it was the right one to make. And so, of course, we were able to provide remote meetings for members as well. And that's one of the things that the board was committed to do, to continue some educational programs for members to attend, even if it were via a remote meeting, like something like Zoom. We were able to continue the strategic planning work that we did and the work on diversity. All of the priorities for the organization continued It was just in a different atmosphere than we had used in the past. So even though we only had 3 in-person meetings prior to the pandemic, I think that we were able to still lead the organization through a very trying time and provide, as Nancy said, the resources for our members. And we worked really hard to make sure that the organizational work went on, even if we weren't meeting in anywhere.
Yeah, so that brings us to kind of what are the responsibilities of the board? And, I think the kind of things we've touched on are probably not what most people think about in terms of board work, but we definitely as a board wish more people knew about. So the work of the board is really to govern. So what does that mean? It is really to set the strategic goals for the organization, to be able to kind of predict the future and to look at what ONS will need to do to continue to meet the needs of our members in terms of the way cancer care will move into the future. It also requires oversight for all of the fiduciary accounts of the organization, both from a budget perspective and also investments. So all of us kind of have learned that, and there's been a lot of development for us in terms of being able to really master some of those skills. Kristen, you had an interesting experience. You came onto the board and immediately moved into a position as treasurer. Can you share what that experience was like?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I don't think many people realize how important the concepts of budgeting are and financial oversight to board service. But like you said, the board has fiduciary responsibilities in overseeing ONS as an organization and ensuring that it's going to continue to survive and be able to produce content for its members. And so it can sound very scary when you come in and you realize, oh, I have to look at a very large budget that I might not be used to. Some people are, if they're running different units in hospitals, they may have some budget experience, but it is different when it's a nonprofit membership based organization. So you learn quickly the streams of revenue, what investments are like. But like you said, there's a lot of education that goes into it. And it's not really unlike managing your own personal budget. It's just at a larger scale and with more support, understandably. And so, like you mentioned, I had the pleasure of serving as treasurer for my first 2 years on the board. And I was anxious, I'll admit, but I had a lot of support from staff, including I worked very closely with the ONS Chief Financial Officer, Jeff DeWalt, and he and others were really helpful in getting me up to speed quickly on ONS financials. Being the treasurer of the ONS board led me to be on a few other subcommittees related to finance, such as the budget subcommittee, or looking at, the building that ONS owns and works out of. And so you really learn what makes a financially healthy organization and what goes into that. But it's definitely the work of all board members to remain up to date on the financials of the organization. And it's really important in the oversight of an organization.
Also, besides being a member of the board of directors, everyone on the board also is a member of a committee, at least one committee, because we don't get all the work done in, a 2 or 4 hour board meeting. Even a 2-day board meeting, a lot of the work goes on. And so I was a member of the budget committee as well, which was kind of a scary thing that Kristen mentioned, but an important one because we reviewed the budgets before the board would approve them. I was a member of the board development committee, which is a committee that provides ongoing education about how to be a good board member. So we've done group work, we've done art therapy, we've evaluated personality types, generational differences, all of those things that impact how we were able to prepare to be a member of the board of directors. There's also a positions committee. ONS has several position statements, to guide our members in what is the best action for certain aspects, such as, hazardous drug safety, let me mention as one of them. And so the positions committee reviews all the position statements every couple of years and makes recommendations for updating them if they need updating. So a lot goes on in the board of directors to help with the direction of the organization and providing resources to our members.
Kristen, I want to just build on something you mentioned, because one of the things I think our members don't understand is the work of the ONS staff and the difference between the staff work and the board work. The ONS staff, there's over 120 employees of ONS that really do the work of the organization. The board's job is to set the plan, to set the strategy. But the staff are really the people who do the work. And there are combinations of nurses and administrators, leaders of the organization, really, who contribute in a very different way to the business part of this. There is really a lot of support and collaboration between the board and the staff. And of course, the CEO, who is really the only one who reports to the board of the staff. The rest of the staff report to the CEO. So it really is a corporation. It runs like a business. And our responsibility as board members is to make sure the interests of the membership is always first and foremost. And that is really around our care delivery to patients and how we best support it. So one of the other difficulties that we endured during our service on the board, and I shouldn't say difficulties, much more like a challenge that really faced our nation, that we also felt very intimately responsible for, was the period during the racial unrest that coexisted actually with the pandemic that all of us had to respond to. And so as a board, we certainly recommitted to inclusivity and did a real review of our membership and staff structures to make sure that at every opportunity we were being inclusive and inviting diversity into all the work that we did. And so there were several things that we were able to do right away, like issue an inclusivity statement across the corporation and begin to address educational needs around diversity into all of our coursework and certainly our conferences. Then actually we took a little bit of a step back and brought on a consultant to make sure that we were really addressing the needs of our members in a much broader and sustainable way. Kristen, did you have an experience as a board member with that work?
Yeah, I was one of our board members who initially recommended that we find a consultant to help us with this work because we believe it's so important and we really do want to make a long-term investment. And so the diversity movement has been great so far in surveying staff and members, getting feedback on what's important to them in relation to DEI. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how they're going to help us move forward as an organization in supporting both the patients that we take care of who are from all different backgrounds, as well as working with each other in oncology nursing, all of us from different backgrounds as well. I was also one of several board members last year that helped to put together a session at ONS Congress on health equity. And we ended up making it two parts because our speakers, Dr. Janice Phillips, Dr. Tamaya Nolan, and Dr. Otis Browley, were so engaging and all agreed that they had so much to share on the topics. So I served as a moderator for one of those sessions, and I just loved fielding questions from the audience, from ONS members, a lot of nurses asking how they could improve health equity at their institutions and within their own practice. And so I agree with you, Nancy. I think these last 2 years have been a real turning point, considering both the pandemic and the increased conversation on the importance of DEI work and how we want to involve it as a board moving forward. Would you agree, Marty?
Yes, I would agree. Certainly, we have come a long way, and of course, there's more to do. So, one of the things that the consultants are doing are helping us to develop an action plan for how to make sure that diversity and inclusivity and equity concepts are embedded in the structure of the organization so that going forward, we're going to make sure our organization focuses on that for our members and the people that we serve.
Well, thank you. It's been so much fun actually to share these reflections with you as we've traveled through this journey together for the last 3 years. I'd like to give you an opportunity to give your last thoughts about your board service and what it has meant to you, and also any advice or thoughts you want to leave our listeners with.
Well, I would love to comment on the strategic planning process. This, of course, I did not expect. I knew we would do strategic planning because being a member of a chapter, we would do that annually. But what the board did was look forward 20 years. We don't have a crystal ball, but we're, committed to having the organization be viable for 20 years. And we had to think about what the members would need and what oncology nursing would need in the next 20 years. And this was a very interesting and exciting project. So I would say if people are interested in moving the organization forward, and if it's important to you, if you're a future thinker, then this is something you might want to consider board service, and also think about how can you turn yourself into a future thinker, because then you'll be able to serve the board. And it's certainly been my pleasure to do that.
I completely agree, Marty. I know that, we had initially done some work back in 2019 and looking 10, 20 years in the future. And when the pandemic came about, we had already discussed a lot about telehealth and virtual care coming up, thinking it would be a little bit further in the future and not the next year in 2020. But we were grateful that we had done some of that forward thinking. But I agree with you. I think that, members listening, I would encourage, if you are an advocate, if you want to move the profession forward, if you have been, progressively involved in ONS and other oncology nursing leadership opportunities, that you would consider using ONS to further your professional development. There's a lot of different leadership opportunities available. And one thing that I would say not a lot of people talk about, but I think should be talked about more often, is that in order to become a leader or an advocate or a strong voice in a profession, you're going to probably fail a lot. And what I mean by failing is that you're going to apply for opportunities that you won't get. I certainly think that, no one puts that on their CV, but I'll just say there's been a lot of opportunities that I've gone for over the years and I haven't gotten, whether they've been jobs or volunteer positions or, leadership opportunities. And I think that it's important to keep trying and not believe that that's going to hold you back, because eventually you are going to start succeeding. And I am very grateful that I was be able to become a member of the ONS board, and this is one of the opportunities that I was able to succeed in coming into, because I've learned a lot. Thank you, Nancy, for allowing us to reflect on our past few years on the board. It's been a pleasure, and we don't always take enough time to reflect. So I really appreciate this last 40 minutes that we've spent together.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Marty, for sharing this today, but also for the time that we've served together and the friendships that we've developed. And I think that's the other thing that, has always been true for me about being involved with ONS. It's not just about the work that we were able to do and the pride that I took in that work, but also in the relationships that I've built along the way that are so meaningful and become lifelong. And I think that's certainly the experience for anybody who's been involved in ONS. So for the last 3 years, they can be described as tumultuous at best. And for me, they just happened to coincide with my board service and then serving as president. When I think about it, despite all the suffering and loss, which has been so considerable, I think we also recognize that there has been a lot of growth and progress as we learn to adapt to the many changes produced by all that happened in the last 3 years. A big part of that was confronting the systemic racism that exists in our world and the need for equity in our health systems and in our association of ONS. It's been really a privilege to serve ONS during this time and to experience the transformation as we defined the strategies that we needed as an organization to lead us into the future, as both of you have just described. So to our listeners, once again, I invite you to consider a leadership role in ONS. The members of the board and the Leadership Development Committee will be at Congress in the Learning Hall, and there are scheduled roundtables on both Friday and Saturday. So if you do want more information about some of what you've heard here today, certainly feel free. That is really a welcoming way to actually talk to, members of the board and also leadership development committee, whose job it is really to recruit new leaders into the organization and help them put them on a pathway that may lead to actually board service or participation in the leadership development committee. If you are attending Congress, that's a good way to do it. But if you're not attending Congress, the Leadership Development Committee is available throughout the year. They have an email address at ldc@ons.org. So if you have an interest or a question, if you feel timid about maybe directly approaching somebody about it, that's a great way to reach out to the LDC. They want to hear from you because, as I said, it's their job to identify future leaders for ONS and will help you to look at how to prepare best to move into these leadership roles. So thank you again to Marty and Kristen for sharing your time today. And I really want to thank Stephanie as well for giving us the opportunity to record this podcast and to reach out to members around this really important topic around the future of our organization. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to the Oncology Nursing Podcast. Tell us about your favorite part of this episode by leaving a review on iTunes or wherever you downloaded your podcast. For more resources and information about oncology nursing, visit us at ons.org or voice.ons.org. The ideas and opinions shared in this episode represent those of the guests and not necessarily ONS.